the ties that bind. The Boston rain pelted against Jackson Miller's car window as he pulled into the long driveway of the Fairchild Estate. The imposing colonial mansion loomed ahead, its windows glowing amber against the slate-gray sky. Jackson killed the engine but remained seated, his knuckles white around the steering wheel. 15 years. 15 years since he'd walked away from Westbrook, Massachusetts. 15 years since he'd seen her. The invitation sat on the passenger seat, its cream-colored cardstock embossed with gold lettering. The Fairchild family cordially invites you to celebrate the life of Eleanor Fairchild. Eleanor, his former mother-in-law. The formidable matriarch who had once called him son, then later called him much worse. With a deep breath, Jackson grabbed his overnight bag and stepped into the rain. The gravel crunched beneath his feet as he approached the house where he'd once believed he belonged. Before he could knock, the massive oak door swung open. Standing in the doorway was Robert Fairchild, Eleanor's only son and Jackson's former brother-in-law. "Jack," Robert said, his voice betraying no emotion. "Wasn't sure you'd show." "I almost didn't," Jackson admitted. They stood in awkward silence until Robert stepped aside. "Well, you're here now. Come in before you drown." The foyer was exactly as Jackson remembered: marble floors, crystal chandelier, family portraits spanning generations of Fairchilds. His shoes squeaked against the polished floor as he followed Robert toward the drawing room. "Most of the family's already here," Robert explained. "Mom's service is tomorrow morning." Jackson nodded, steeling himself for what was to come. "And Sarah? Is she?" "Yes," Robert cut him off. "She's here with her daughter." "Daughter?" The word hit Jackson like a physical blow. Of course Sarah would have moved on, built a new life. What had he expected? Robert paused outside the drawing room doors. "Listen, whatever happened between you two, it's ancient history. Mom's gone, and she wanted the family together one last time. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "I'm not here to cause trouble," Jackson promised. Robert searched his face, then nodded curtly. "Good. Then let's get this over with." The drawing room fell silent as they entered. A dozen pairs of eyes turned toward Jackson, some curious, some hostile. In the corner, by the grand piano, stood Sarah. 15 years had been kind to her. Her dark hair was shorter now, framing her face in soft waves. She wore a simple black dress, elegant and understated. Their eyes met across the room, and for a brief moment, time seemed to fold in on itself. Then a young girl appeared at Sarah's side, and the spell was broken. "Everyone," Robert announced, "you remember Jackson Miller." The room offered a murmur of acknowledgement. Jackson forced a smile, nodding to familiar faces, cousins, aunts, old family friends. All the while, he was acutely aware of Sarah watching him. A tall, silver-haired man approached, extending his hand. "Miller. Been a long time. Harrison Blackwood. Sarah's father and Eleanor's longtime business partner." "Mr. Blackwood," Jackson replied, shaking the offered hand. "Didn't think we'd see you here," Harrison said, his tone measured. "Eleanor invited me." Jackson reached into his pocket, producing an envelope identical to the one in his car, but with a handwritten note attached. "Personally." Harrison's eyebrows rose slightly, but he said nothing more before moving away. Throughout the evening, Jackson navigated a minefield of loaded conversations and meaningful glances. Family members approached to offer condolences for Eleanor, as if she had been his loss too, while subtly probing for details about his life. He answered politely but vaguely. Yes, his architectural firm in Seattle was doing well. No, he hadn't remarried. Yes, he was surprised by Eleanor's invitation too. What he didn't say was how receiving that envelope had shaken him to his core. How reading Eleanor's handwritten note, "There are things you should know, Jackson," had kept him awake for nights. As the gathering thinned, Jackson found himself alone in the library, nursing a glass of Eleanor's prized scotch. The room was a sanctuary of leather-bound books and rich mahogany, unchanged since the days when he'd spent hours here discussing literature with the woman who had once welcomed him into her family. "She kept your books, you know." Jackson turned to find Sarah standing in the doorway. Up close, he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the subtle streaks of silver in her hair. She looked more beautiful than he remembered. "My books?" he asked. Sarah stepped into the room. "The ones you left behind." She kept them right where they were. She gestured to a shelf near the window. "Said someone might want them someday." Jackson set his glass down, unsure what to say. After 15 years of imagined conversations, he found himself at a loss for words. "Your daughter seems lovely," he finally managed. A strange expression crossed Sarah's face. "Lily's. She's wonderful." "She looks like you," Jackson said, though this wasn't entirely true. There was something familiar about the girl that he couldn't place. Sarah's hands twisted together, a nervous habit she'd always had. "Jack, there's something—" "There you are," came a voice from the doorway. Robert stood there, gaze flicking between them. "Sarah, Lily's looking for you." Sarah hesitated, then nodded. "We'll talk later," she said to Jackson, before slipping past her brother. Robert lingered, studying Jackson with narrowed eyes. "Mom left something for you in her will." Jackson blinked in surprise. "For me? Why would she?" "The reading is the day after tomorrow," Robert continued. "She was very specific about you being there." Jackson's mind raced. "Robert, what's going on? Why did Eleanor invite me here after all this time?" For a moment, Robert seemed to wrestle with himself. "It's not my place to say. But whatever you're thinking, Jack, it's probably worse." With that cryptic statement, he walked away, leaving Jackson alone with his thoughts. That night, sleep eluded Jackson. He tossed and turned in the guest bedroom, surrounded by Fairchild family photographs and heirlooms. Outside, the rain continued to fall, drumming against the windows like impatient fingers. Around 2 a.m., he gave up and wandered downstairs, drawn once again to the library. He wasn't looking for anything specific, just peace, perhaps, or a distraction from the questions swirling in his mind. As he scanned the bookshelves, his fingers trailed over familiar spines. Hemingway, Fitzgerald, Steinbeck. The American classics Eleanor had introduced him to during those long summer evenings when he was first dating Sarah. His hand paused on a volume of Thoreau. His favorite, the one he'd discussed with Eleanor hours before he'd proposed to Sarah. He pulled it from the shelf, and something fluttered to the floor. A photograph, yellowed with age. Jackson bent to retrieve it, then froze. It was a picture of Sarah, clearly pregnant, standing in the garden behind the house. Based on her clothing and the foliage, it must have been fall 15 years ago, just months after he'd left. Jackson's heart hammered in his chest. The timing, the secretive invitation, the strange way everyone had been looking at him all day. Lily wasn't just Sarah's daughter. She was his daughter too. The realization hit him with such force that he had to grip the bookshelf for support. He had a child, a 15-year-old girl who had grown up without him, who probably didn't even know he existed. You weren't supposed to find that. Jackson whirled around. Sarah stood in the doorway, wrapped in a robe, her face pale in the dim light. "Is it true?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Is Lily mine?" Sarah closed her eyes briefly, then stepped into the room, closing the door behind her. "Yes." A single word, but it changed everything. Jackson sank into the nearest chair, the photograph still clutched in his hand. "Why didn't you tell me?" he demanded, anger and grief battling within him. "Tell you?" Sarah's laugh was bitter. "You disappeared, Jack. Left in the middle of the night with nothing but a note saying you couldn't do this anymore. I didn't know you were pregnant." "And would it have changed anything if you had?" she challenged. Jackson wanted to say yes, of course it would have, but the truth was more complicated. He'd been young, terrified of being consumed by the Fairchild legacy, suffocated by expectations he couldn't meet. "I had a right to know," he said instead. Yes, you did, Sarah agreed, surprising him. I tried to find you, Jack. For 3 months, I searched. Your parents claimed they didn't know where you were. Your friends said the same. It was like you'd vanished. Jackson ran a hand through his hair. I was in Alaska working construction. I needed space. Space, Sarah repeated as if tasting the word. Well, you got 15 years of it. The accusation stung, but it was fair. Does she know about me? Sarah hesitated. She knows her father wasn't ready for a family. That's all. And now? Jackson asked. What happens now? Sarah moved to the window, looking out at the rain-soaked gardens. I don't know. This wasn't how I planned to tell you. Mom. She trailed off. Eleanor knew, Jackson realized. That's why she wanted me here. Sarah nodded slowly. She made me promise before she died that I'd tell you the truth. Said it wasn't right, keeping you from your daughter. I think it was her way of making amends. Jackson remembered the note. There are things you should know. Eleanor, even in death, trying to right the family's wrongs. I want to meet her, Jackson said. Properly. As her father. Sarah turned to face him, her expression unreadable. And then what? You go back to Seattle, send birthday cards, visit at Christmas? She's not a project you can dip in and out of, Jack. She's a person. I know that, he said quietly. And I don't have all the answers. But I've missed 15 years, I don't want to miss any more. For a long moment, Sarah studied him, as if searching for the boy she'd once loved in the man who stood before her. Finally, she nodded. Tomorrow after the service, she said. We'll tell her together. The following day passed in a blur. The funeral service was elegant and understated, just as Eleanor would have wanted. Jackson sat near the back of the church, watching as family members shared memories of a woman who had been both feared and revered. When it was Sarah's turn to speak, she told a story about her mother teaching her to sail, how Eleanor had thrown her into the deep end, literally and figuratively, insisting that failure was the best teacher. She raised us to be strong, Sarah concluded, her voice steady. To weather any storm. And for that, I will always be grateful. Her eyes met Jackson's briefly, and he understood the message. Whatever happened next, they would face it head-on, for Lily's sake. After the service, as guests mingled at the reception, Sarah found him and led him to a quiet corner of the garden. She's by the pond, she said. I've told her someone important wants to meet her. Jackson's throat tightened. What if she hates me? Sarah's expression softened. She's a teenager. She might, but she's also curious and kind and stubborn as hell. Give her time. Together, they walked the familiar path to the small pond at the edge of the property. Jackson had proposed to Sarah here, on a summer evening much like this one, with fireflies dancing above the water. Lily sat on the old wooden dock, her legs dangling over the edge. As they approached, she looked up and Jackson's breath caught. She had Sarah's delicate features, but his eyes, deep blue and questioning. Lily, Sarah called softly, there's someone I'd like you to meet. The girl stood, brushing off her black dress. Up close, the resemblance was unmistakable. Jackson forced himself to breathe. Lily, Sarah said, her voice remarkably steady, this is Jackson Miller. Your father. Lily's eyes widened, darting between them. What? I know this is a shock, Jackson began, and I'm so sorry. You're my dad. Lily interrupted, her voice rising. All this time and you just show up now? Because great-grandma died. Lily, it's complicated, Sarah interjected. No, it's not, Lily shot back. He left. He didn't want us. That's not true, Jackson said, taking a step forward. I didn't know about you. If I had. You'd what? Lily demanded, tears welling in her eyes. You'd have stayed? Played happy family? I'd have been there, Jackson said firmly. I wouldn't have missed a single day. Lily stared at him, searching his face for lies. Why should I believe you? It was a fair question, one Jackson wasn't sure he could answer. But before he could try, a commotion erupted from the house. Voices raised in alarm, people rushing toward the garden. Robert appeared on the path, his face ashen. Sarah. It's Dad. He's collapsed. Everything moved in fast forward after that. The ambulance, the frantic ride to the hospital, the sterile waiting room where the Fairchild family now gathered, united in worry. Harrison had suffered a heart attack, severe, but not immediately fatal. As they waited for news, Jackson found himself sitting next to Lily, both of them silent and uncomfortable. He's going to be okay, Jackson said eventually, though he had no way of knowing if this was true. Lily nodded stiffly, her hands clutched in her lap. He's the only grandfather I've ever known, she said quietly. The words stung, but Jackson deserved them. I know, and I'm not trying to replace him or anyone else in your life. I want a chance to know you. Lily studied him, her expression unreadable. Mom says you build things. Buildings. I do, Jackson confirmed. I'm an architect. Is that why you left? For your career? Jackson shook his head. No. I left because I was scared. The Fairchilds, they're a lot to take on. Your great-grandmother, especially. I felt like I was drowning, losing myself. To his surprise, Lily's expression flickered with understanding. Great-grandma could be intense, she admitted. Mom says I got my stubbornness from her. Despite everything, Jackson smiled. You probably got some from both sides. I'm not exactly known for backing down easily. A ghost of a smile touched Lily's lips before she remembered she was supposed to be angry with him. The doctor emerged then, informing them that Harrison was stable but would need bypass surgery. The family breathed a collective sigh of relief, and Robert began organizing who would stay at the hospital and who would return to the house. In the midst of the planning, Lily slipped away. Jackson found her outside, sitting on a bench in the hospital garden. Is Grandpa really going to be okay? She asked as he approached. It sounds like it, Jackson said, sitting beside her but keeping a respectful distance. Your family is strong. Resilchers, as your great-grandmother used to say. Lily looked surprised. That's what she always told me when I was upset. Fairchilds are resilchers, Lily. We bend, but we don't break. Jackson nodded. She said the same to your mother. And to me once. They fell into silence again, but it felt less strained. I have your eyes, Lily said suddenly. Mom never said it, but I always wondered where they came from. Hers are brown. So are Grandpa's and great-grandma's. My mother's were blue, Jackson told her. And her father's before that. Lily seemed to consider this, storing away the information like a puzzle piece that might eventually form a complete picture. I'm not asking you to forgive me, Jackson said carefully, or even to like me. Just, maybe we could start with getting to know each other? If that's something you might want. Lily was quiet for so long that Jackson thought she might refuse. Finally, she spoke. Great-grandma left me all her books. Said I was the only one who appreciated them properly. She glanced at him. Mom said you used to read a lot too. It was an olive branch, small, but significant. I still do, Jackson said. What are you reading now? As Lily began to describe her current literary obsession, Jackson felt a cautious hope bloom in his chest. They had a long road ahead, but this was a start. The next 2 days unfolded in a series of emotional revelations. Harrison's surgery was successful, bringing relief to the family. Meanwhile, the reading of Eleanor's will delivered the final surprise she had orchestrated from beyond the grave. To Jackson Miller, the lawyer read from the formal document, I leave the cottage at Lake Champlain, with the condition that it never be sold out of the family. The lawyer paused, then continued, along with a letter to be read privately. The room erupted in murmurs of shock. The lake house was one of the most cherished Fairchild properties, a place where generations had spent their summers. For Eleanor to leave it to Jackson, an outsider who had abandoned the family, was unfathomable. After the reading, the lawyer handed Jackson a sealed envelope. Mrs. Fairchild was very specific about this, he said. Alone in the library once more, Jackson broke the seal with trembling hands. Inside was a single sheet of Eleanor's monogram stationery, covered in her distinctive handwriting. Jackson, if you're reading this, you've met Lily, and you know the truth. For that I am glad. Some secrets are too heavy to carry to the grave. I owe you an apology, one I was too proud to give in life. When you left Sarah, I was furious. I believed you were weak, unworthy of my daughter and the Fairchild name. I used my influence to make it difficult for her to find you, intercepting letters, misleading investigators. In my arrogance, I thought I was protecting her. I was wrong. In keeping you from your child, I deprived Lily of her father and perpetuated the cycle of rigid control that has haunted our family for generations. The lake house is yours because it was there 15 years ago that you told me you felt truly at peace. Perhaps it can be a place where you, Sarah, and Lily might find your way forward, together or apart, but on your own terms, not mine. Eleanor. Jackson sat immobile, the letter clutched in his hands. All these years, he'd believed Sarah hadn't tried hard enough to find him. Meanwhile, Eleanor had been pulling strings, ensuring they remained separated. The realization was both infuriating and heartbreaking. A knock at the door pulled him from his thoughts. Sarah entered, her expression cautious. Robert told me about the lake house, she said. It's unexpected. Jackson handed her the letter wordlessly. He watched as she read it, her face cycling through shock, anger, and finally, a profound sadness. All this time, she whispered, sinking into a chair, she let me believe you didn't want to be found. Would it have made a difference? Jackson asked. If you had found me? Sarah looked up, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. I was carrying your child, Jack. I loved you. Of course it would have made a difference. The admission hung between them, fragile and powerful. Jackson moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. I never stopped loving you, he confessed. Tried. God knows I tried. But there was always a Sarah-shaped hole in my life that nothing else could fill. A tear slipped down her cheek. We can't go back. No, he agreed. But maybe we can go forward. Not the way we were, but something new. For Lily's sake at least. Sarah squeezed his hands. And for ours. Before Jackson could answer, the library door swung open again. Lily stood there, watching them with those perceptive blue eyes. Sorry, she said, starting to back away. I didn't mean to interrupt. You're not interrupting, Sarah assured her, quickly wiping away her tears. Come in. Lily approached cautiously, her gaze landing on the letter still in Sarah's hand. Great-grandma left you something? A truth long overdue, Jackson said. And a place, the lake house. Lily's eyes widened. She left you the lake house? But that's where we spend every summer. I know, Jackson said. And that won't change. It's still your family's home. He paused, then added quietly, maybe it can be our family's home too, in some way. Lily looked between her parents, sensing the weight of the moment. What happens now? She asked, unconsciously echoing Jackson's question from days earlier. Sarah reached out, taking Lily's hand and keeping hold of Jackson's with her other. For a moment, they formed a circle, connected physically if not yet emotionally. Now, Sarah said, we take it one day at a time. Together. As the summer sun dipped low over Lake Champlain, casting golden ripples across the water, Jackson sat on the dock watching Sarah and Lily sail the small boat he'd helped them repair. Their laughter carried across the water, a sound he'd once thought he'd never hear. The past 2 months had been a journey of rediscovery, painful at times, joyful at others. There were still moments when Lily looked at him with wariness, when Sarah retreated into old hurts. But there were also nights around the campfire sharing stories, mornings of pancake breakfasts, and long walks where they pieced together the missing years of each other's lives. Jackson's phone buzzed beside him. It was a message from his business partner in Seattle. Final papers signed. Seattle office officially transferred. Boston team excited to meet you. He smiled, putting the phone away. Last week, he'd made the decision to relocate his firm's headquarters to Boston. It wasn't just for Sarah and Lily, though they were certainly the catalysts. It was for himself too, a chance to reclaim the life he'd abandoned and build something new from its foundation. Sarah guided the boat back to shore, Lily expertly managing the sails just as Eleanor had once taught Sarah. "Dad!" Lily called out, still a new word, still precious every time she used it. "Did you see? I didn't capsize us once." "I saw," he called back, his chest swelling with pride. "You're a natural, just like your mom." As they secured the boat and joined him on the dock, Jackson noticed Sarah watching him with a soft expression he was coming to recognize, part wonder, part cautious hope. "Everything okay?" she asked, noting the phone in his hand. "Everything's perfect," he replied. "The Boston office is official. I'm officially East Coast based again." Lily's face lit up. "So you'll be here? Like all the time?" "That's the plan," Jackson confirmed. "If that's okay with both of you." Sarah's smile was answer enough, but she added, "More than okay." As they walked back to the cottage, Eleanor's final gift that had become their second chance, Jackson felt a sense of completion he'd never expected to find. The journey wasn't over. There were still wounds to heal, trust to rebuild, and a future to create together. But standing on the porch, watching the sunset with his daughter's head on his shoulder and Sarah's hand in his, Jackson knew that Eleanor had been right. Some secrets were too heavy to carry to the grave, but some truths were powerful enough to bring life from ashes. The Fairchild legacy would continue, not as a burden to be escaped, but as a foundation for something new, something built not on obligation and expectation, but on choice, forgiveness, and love. Eleanor would have approved.